Okay, hello everyone. Oh, hi. Hi to all the people I know. Thanks so much for joining me here in my light-filled garage workspace in DeForest in Wisconsin. Um, as people as people file into the Zoom, I'm just going to introduce myself briefly as Mitch Frank. Uh, I'm currently teaching faculty and instructor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I teach in the textiles and fashion design program. And I teach sewn construction and fashion design classes. Um, I came to be part of New York Textile Month because in 2022, I was a finalist for the Dorothy Waxman Prize, which is a really amazing part of New York Textile Month. And I've been part of that cohort since then, attended events in the previous New York Textile Months, and this time have some content that I want to share with everybody myself. So continuing here to allow as many people as can to join the call, just wanted to introduce everybody to my colleague, a very late season monarch butterfly caterpillar who is currently working on eating some of a milkweed species called world milkweed, as in like whirling world milkweed. And like I'll talk about later on, all species of milkweed that I've worked with have pretty good bast fiber in their stems. And part of the vision that I imagine for this information is a biodiverse fiber material sourcing chain. So in theory, that might look like a field that's been planted with all different kinds of species of milkweed, that the plants are allowed to go through their life cycle until they drop their leaves, at which point they're not especially useful to wildlife. Then they could be harvested and processed for fiber. So just sharing again, I have here, I'll put him on a living plant after the talk. I'll put them on a living plant after the talk, but this is a very late season monarch butterfly caterpillar. Probably, if they successfully metamorphose, probably one of the last individuals to do so before they all migrate south. Okay, with that, I'm going to scoot up closer to my computer. The majority of this time is going to be a slideshow, PowerPoint slideshow. And then afterwards, I'll open back up to the camera and try to field some questions. I see my mom just signed on. Hi, Mom. Hi, Noah. Hi again to everybody that I know. Thanks so much for coming out. And so happy to meet all of the rest of you. Okay, so bear with me while I fire up this slideshow. And I want to start with a few acknowledgements. To begin with, I want to start by acknowledging my colleague Marianne Fairbanks and her project at UW-Madison, the Hemp Lab. Marianne's vision and leadership in this craft laboratory has really inspired me. I also want to thank Ian Danner, who's pictured to the left of Marianne. Ian is an MFA candidate at UW. And his work as a spinner, yarn spinner, as a educator, as an artist has also been very inspirational. The Hemp Lab uh, accomplishes a lot of things, but one of them is that it puts students directly in touch with this living or formerly living plant material that comes from cannabis hemp plants. They turn it into fiber. And finally, I want to very deeply thank Noah Rickey, another MFA candidate at UW-Madison. When I first started working in the program, I visited the hemp lab, and while I was there, I watched as Noah picked up a bundle of fiber and twisted it into something that was recognizably finished twine. And by watching them and receiving this little length of fiber, I learned to make cordage myself. And that's been a huge influence on me, as well as the rest of Noah's work, which is really awesome artwork. So Marianne and Ian and Noah, their names are at the bottom of the screen, and they all have great websites, which are just their first name and last name.com. I also want to thank and acknowledge a student in the Textiles and Fashion Design program, Alexandria McCourt. I advised Alexandria in applying for an opportunity at UW called the Chipstone CDMC Research Fellowship. And she used the fellowship funding to experiment with growing milkweed and turning the plants into yarn. And Alexandria was so diligent and creative in this research, and I feel lucky that I got to advise her in it. In this acknowledgement section, I want to conclude by acknowledging that UW-Madison and my home here in DeForest, Wisconsin, occupy the ancestral land of the Ho-Chunk people called Dejop, or Four Lakes. And in my backyard, the Mai Yahara, or the Yahara River, flows right up to the lawn in our backyard, and that feeds into Lake Mendota, which is the northernmost lake of those four lakes, for which Dejop is named. The 12 First Nations of Wisconsin have occupied and tended to these lands since time immemorial, and they are still here. Just catching up with my slides. As the Ho-Chunk Nation reminds us, I'm quoting them, more than likely, we will always be here. I'm going to take this moment to read out the names of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. These are in alphabetical order. The Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, the Brothertown Indian Nation, Forest County Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk Nation, Lac Courte d'Oreille Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, Lac du Flambeau Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, Oneida Nation, Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, Sokogan Chippewa Community, the Mole Lake Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, St. Croix Chippewa Indians of Wisconsin, and the Stockbridge Muncie Community Band of Mohican Indians. So to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about the question, why bast fiber? This is in general, probably very informed group of people in fibers, but the why of bast fiber, to me, has a lot to do with environmental sustainability. Right now, we're looking at cotton bolls on the plant, and cotton is not a bast fiber. Cotton is called a seed hair fiber, and bast fiber grows in the stems of plants. And cotton fiber is, um, first of all, absolutely wonderful and beautiful, but it's difficult to grow in ways that um, that are even a little bit okay for nature, at least to grow in industrial scale. And the common practice of growing like non-organic cotton um, involves a really astronomical amount of water use. Um, it's a monocrop, so no other plants can grow around it. And it requires a lot of pesticides to keep bugs and other wildlife from preying on the plant itself. Um, Another way that cotton taxes the environment is through the commonplace practice of defoliation. This cotton plant, this picture was taken immediately or shortly after the plant was sprayed with an arsenic compound, which is used to quickly kill the leaves. Uh, the leaves would, if left in place, interfere with the machines used to harvest the plant. And this practice of spraying heavy metal chemicals on cotton plants to defoliate them results in headlines like this: dangerously high levels of arsenic and cadmium found in store-bought rice. Because the fields where cotton used to be grown have very often in the South been flooded and turned into rice paddies, which dissolves those toxic chemicals back into the water and allows the rice to take it up. So that is one example, concrete example of one of the ways that cotton can be very taxing on the environment and on our own lives. In contrast, bast fiber comes from the stem of the plant, which I think you can visualize well with the image on the left showing cannabis hemp being peeled off of the stem. On the right, there's a microscopic photo of the stem of a flax plant. And flax, when it's turned into fiber, is called linen. Bast fiber plant sources are generally a lower impact alternative to cotton. There are a few species, maybe 5 to 7 species of bast fiber plants that are commercially important. 3 species that are well known for making apparel fabric are hemp, rami, and flax. Rami is a relative of the stinging nettle plant. These plants all grow very tall and straight, so their stems yield long and straight fiber strands, and they're able to grow very densely. For that reason, some of the species can yield more fiber per acre than cotton with fewer agricultural inputs, like water, fertilizer, pesticide, and so on. So bast fiber can be a fiber source that is alternative to cotton, which is less taxing on the environment than cotton. One interesting aspect of bast fiber is that it is very hard work to make the plant into fiber. The plants need to have the fiber loosened from the stems through a process called retting. These GIFs are from British Pathé, which has some cool archival videos of the linen industry. These show an industrial setting for processing linen into fiber. After retting, the fiber is stripped from the stems by a breaking and sketching, which is also called decortication. The stripped fiber is combed and carded and eventually spun into yarn or cordage, which is then often woven into fabric or knitted into knitted fabric. And there are a variety of native to North America plants that can be harvested for bast fiber for textile applications equivalent to linen and cannabis hemp. These plants have been tended and used by Indigenous people for millennia. And it's important to me to state clearly that these people's traditions as sovereign nations must be respected and honored in research involving these materials. And the materials are grown by two main groups of fiber-bearing plants, the dogbanes and milkweeds, which are one group in the Apocynaceae family, the dogbane family, and then a variety of species in the nettles family, the Urticaceae family. Species from these same genera have been used for fiber wherever they occur. For example, there are dogbane species from Southern Europe and Central Asia called swordleaf dogbane and kendir, which have been used by folk and by native communities for fiber. In the nettles family, rami is often still considered a folk fiber, and Himalayan nettles, or what's locally called aloe, is used locally as a fiber source. This is a relative, this is another Apocynaceae family member, giant milkweed, which grows in the Indian subcontinent. And the fiber that's made from giant milkweed is known as mudar. Also want to note now that Native Americans use many more species than I cover in this talk to make different types of fiber and fiber objects. And those types of fiber can come from the inner barks of trees, for example, or from grass-type plants. And I have worked less with those fibers because they're less relevant to making apparel fabric, which is my area of interest and my distant goal. Research into fiber plants that are native to this land starts with the fiberways of native people. And fortunately, to some extent, this material culture is preserved in museum collections. I'm compelled by artifacts in museums that display the fiber frankly and evince the process of making it. The Autry Museum of the American West hosts this series of photographs of Fernando Librado, a Chumash man, taken by Gerald Cassidy in 1912. Fernando is making twine from nettles, and he collects the plants, strips the fiber and bark from the stems, scutches the bark from the fiber, combs the fiber, and spins it into cordage. All the same steps that those videos from British Pathé showed in an industrial setting, and similar steps that I witnessed Noah undertaking in the hemp lab. The Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian collects many raw material examples, like this bundle of dogbane stems that was collected from the Northern Paiute people in the early 1900s. Here's another bundle of more extensively processed dogbane from the Yakima people who reside in Washington. This is a characteristically grayish, whitish milkweed fiber bundle collected from the Mesa Grande Diegueño. These stems also are recognizably milkweed from the Cumaye Diegueño, collected in the 1950s, which is relatively late, and it's an interesting example for that reason. I really appreciate these photographs by an unknown photographer in California, which treat the objects with aesthetic respect. These are carrying nets from the Cahuilla people of Southern California. They're attested to be made from milkweed fiber cordage. Since they're black and white, it's a little bit hard to say how accurate that is. Again, just very much appreciating the photographer's work in composing these nets to show their ingenuity and their craftsmanship. This is another carrying net from the Autry Museum, which is made from dog bane. And interestingly, the carrying handles combine yucca and dog bane. You can see the light colored yucca leaf fibers with the dog bane twined together. This is a carrying net from the Luiseño people, and it's made from nettle cordage. And this is a really impressively fine fishing net from the Autry Museum, attested to be unknown fiber, but I would guess pretty conclusively that it's dog bane based on the color. That reddish color is pretty diagnostic for dog bane. No other fiber looks like that. Nettle and milkweed can be harder to tell apart because they range from gray to white to khaki. All of these artifacts that I've shared pictures of display the material knowledge of the people, how they gathered and how they held these fibers in their hands and made them into useful and beautiful objects. Bast fiber textiles were an everyday presence in Indigenous life. These balls of cordage, which are attested to be unknown vegetal fiber, but are probably nettle or milkweed, were made by Ho-Chunk people. They were collected in 1909, but were probably made before the year 1900. In the National Museum of the American Indian collection, there are many unidentified and even misidentified fiber artifacts. All of the artifacts on this page, for example, are identified as being milkweed fiber, but because of that diagnostic reddish color, they're almost certainly dog bane. That, I think, isn't indicating necessarily anything nefarious, but just the difficulty of cataloging items that are donated over a really great breadth of time with questionable sourcing. Maybe the sourcing was nefarious. I don't know. But a project to audit the collection for fiber accuracy might be an interesting avenue for future research. Talking now about contemporary North American fiber practices, I want to begin by emphasizing again that Native American tribes continue to use their ancestral fibers. And just to say with my words that I seek to support and, if I'm lucky, collaborate with Indigenous fiber practitioners as I continue my research. That research includes contemporary accounts of using plants that are native to North America to make fiber. These are some scans from a 2003 issue of Spin-Off magazine. where Carol Johnson Collins writes about the work of Elizabeth Dyack in processing and spinning fiber from common milkweed. In my research, this article was really foundational to being able to work with the fiber. And this issue can be purchased as a PDF for like $5 to $7 from Spinoff. It's really worth a read. That was in 2003. This is a blog post from 2014 where a blogger, Linda Ash, wrote about processing milkweed into spinnable tow fiber. And I'll talk about distinctions between line fiber and tow fiber later. The photos that she shared online really captured the look of milkweed fiber. You can see the top left image shows the silvery, shiny look of milkweed fiber in the bark. This post from 2020 by Sarah C. Sweat shares a really poetic reflection and really charming illustrations about working with common milkweed fiber, following a slightly different process from the tow fiber version. In this process, Sarah Sweat peels the green bark from the stems of milkweed and then strips the fiber from the bark, which I have found to be the best way to get long usable fiber from this specific species of milkweed. In February of 2020, Nicholas Wenner published a really comprehensive article on fibershed.org describing the ways that he and collaborators worked with dogbane, common milkweed, and nettles. This is a really foundational article to my research and a wonderful read. I also really appreciate how he expresses a hopeful vision for, quote, an integrated system that could make use of multiple types of bast fiber plants. That's a vision that I share. These plants that I'm talking about and their relatives are so very widespread throughout North America, and they're really common within their ranges. None of them are hard to find, these specific species. They're all present in New York and Wisconsin, and I'm lucky enough to be able to gather fiber from all of them within walking distance from my home. Here I'm sharing some maps. All the green pins that are dropped show the presence of dogbane, common milkweed, and slender nettles in and around New York. I guess I'll also digress a little bit to say that I haven't worked as much with the Urticaceae genus, with the nettles, because there's a history of nettles for fiber that's been well researched in Europe, especially. And with my focus on native North American fiber plants, there's a little bit of difficulty there because until recently, it was thought that stinging nettles in America were planted by European colonizers. The phylogeny has been updated, and it's now understood that there is a native species of stinging nettles called slender nettles, which would be the species often used by Native Americans to make cordage. But there also was the European species of stinging nettles introduced, and the degree that one has taken over the other or that they've hybridized is not well understood. So there are some technicalities or some getting into the weeds around indigeneity regarding nettles that just kind of pulled me more towards using the Apocynaceae plants. Also wanting to digress from the digression to share that I made these maps using the app iNaturalist, which I really want to advocate for as a public resource that's publicly funded. So if anybody happens to get iNaturalist after this talk and wants to donate, like I do, iNaturalist would really appreciate it. It's a wildlife and plant identification app, like Picture This or like Google Lens. It's different because the species that are logged by users become public information, which are used as a huge database to monitor populations. So the way it works is that you open the app and then you use the plus sign to log a new species. Here's an example of a bug that is an obligate predator of milkweed plants, the swamp milkweed leaf beetle. And the app provides AI identification tools. So if you don't know what something is, the app can suggest based on the photo what you're looking at. And after that, the identification can be verified or corrected by other users, which is really helpful. It's also very helpful because you can use the Explore tool. I see that with that square, I highlighted the wrong thing. You use the magnifying glass icon to explore, and it'll show you records that have been made in your area. So this is right near my house. I guess I'm doxing myself, which I didn't think of earlier. But so you can then filter for specific taxa. You can write the common name or the scientific name of species that you're looking for. So whether you're a food forager or a fiber forager or natural dye forager, this tool is really helpful. And it's one that I use almost every day. In my material research, when I locate these plants, I start by extracting a minimum spinnable amount of fiber by breaking the plant stems and stripping the fibers by hand, then sketching them with my thumbnail, and then thigh spinning or hand twisting the fibers into cordage. This is a fundamental textile material that is proof of concept for me for the workability of these fibers. And as I'll share in a couple slides, further processing yields finer and softer material. I have worked with and extracted fiber from about a dozen species, many of them in the milkweed genus, which is in the dogbane family. In all these cases, manually spinning the fibers to make cordage. Just catching up with my notes here. The samples on screen are first dogbane, which is characteristically red. The second is a very fine cordage of common milkweed. And I obtained that fiber by peeling the green bark and then removing the fiber from the bark while it was still wet. The third example is swamp milkweed, which I actually found. I found basically fully redded out in the wild after a cold winter. I guess the freezes and thaws had effectively prevented the fiber from rotting, but also degraded the bark and the pith or the woody core of the plant. So that when I found it, I could really tell how someone would imagine getting fiber material out of this plant. So I'm zooming in now. I hope that that is happening for you all as well. But this on the left, unprocessed fiber, is what it looks like on basically a stick. And I think that was a really interesting moment to see how people without the benefit of foreknowledge or the internet would come upon a material like this and think to themselves that they could use it for something else. Um, Other than the dogbane and milkweeds, I've also found a handful of more species that aren't on the record as fiber sources, which is part of the research that makes me think like, oh, this is pretty cool. The fourth example in this image is from a species called Amsonia hubrichtii, which is also called blue star. Amsonia is part of the dogbane family, so it's maybe not surprising that it also has good fiber in the stem. And then the fifth example, the very dark fiber, comes from a plant called false indigo or wild indigo, the scientific name Baptisia. There are a handful of species in the Baptisia genus, and they'll have this really interesting looking fiber in the stems. So looking a little bit closer at Amsonia, it is a member of the dogbane family, and its natural range is restricted more towards the central and southern United States. But it has become a very, very popular garden plant, which is how I find it in Wisconsin, where it's not native. The species that I found work best for fiber are Ozark blue star, which is Amsonia hubrichtii, and showy blue star. There's another species that's commonly gardened called Amsonia tabernae montana, which is eastern blue star, which just doesn't grow quite as tall, although the stems bear just as much fiber as the other species. And finding that this dogbane relative also had good fiber in the stems really drove home for me how much more there is to explore with potential bast fiber-bearing species. One example of a dogbane family relative that I'd really like to experiment with or encourage someone else to experiment with is from a genus called Cynancum, which is also called honey vine or milkweed vine. And my theory is that if a plant is growing a vine, it's growing very long stems, and that makes you wonder how long those fibers could be that grow inside the stems, assuming there is usable fiber in them. And part of what I hope to accomplish with my talk today is just to get the word out about Amsonia fiber. It's pretty much not hard to find anywhere because it's so commonly used in gardens. And it grows in these very dense clumps. So if you find an Amsonia plant, it's going to yield 60 to 100 stems to work with. And it's very rewarding to work with as well. I'll probably have time to do a demonstration after the slides are done. Oh, just pointing out the native range of the honey vine does not extend up to Wisconsin, so I haven't been able to find an example of it yet. Here are some examples of fiber that I've gotten out of Amsonia species. This is showing a long line fiber, which is the flax industry term for these long continuous bast fibers that go basically from the root of the plant up to the very tip of it. And the very finest, longest fibers are what is used to spin the very finest and most strong linen yarn. Here's some fine cordage that I made. And then moving on to talking about the Baptisia species. So these plants are a member of the pea or bean or legume family. One interesting thing about many members of the legume family is that they have a symbiotic relationship with microbes underground, um, which works to fix nitrogen in the soil. And so by growing legumes, you're actively, well, not all species of legumes, but the species that are nitrogen fixing, you're actively improving the quality of the soil around the plant. Um, and Baptisia species are very, very common prairie and woodland plants. You know what, I should say they're very widespread. They're not quite as common as milkweeds and dogbanes, but it's not at all rare to find one and encounter one on a hike. And in our Wisconsin prairies, there are huge areas where they grow naturally. Their flowers are really beautiful, so it's a sight to behold when they're blooming. So knowing that this species of legume can provide fiber, I just used Google to look up whether any other legumes are used in fiber industry. And it turns out that there is a species that's very closely related to Baptisia called sun hemp, which is native to Southeast Asia and cultivated now throughout the tropics, including in South America and Africa, that's used for like cordage grade fiber. And that leads me also to wonder what other legumes might provide fiber. This is a species of prairie shrub called false indigo bush, which grows quite tall. So again, if it's growing very tall, maybe it can provide very long fibers. Some other examples that I've recently had a chance to work with are lead plant, which looks a lot like false indigo bush. And lead plant is like one of the keystone plant species of the prairie because its roots grow down like yards and yards deep to anchor the soil and prevent erosion. And I only took a little bit of the plant, but it did have this same kind of coarse and dark fiber that false indigo does. Here's an example of the long line fiber that I can get from wild indigo, which has a really interesting character that is pretty unique to me. It's still possible to turn it into very fine cordage. And here's an example of an Amsonia and Baptisia cord that I made, showing the contrast in the color. I've continued to process the plants into fiber and the fiber into yarn, moving on from just using my hands to using wool combs and a hand spindle. I've also worked with wet processes to clean and soften the fiber, and I've used natural and synthetic dyes to color them. And this card shows some of the results of that research. This is all Amsonia hebrechtii. On the left are long line fibers. The top 5 are singles yarn that's roughly 10s size. With the natural yarn, the white example below it being scoured with lye, which is a practice that I was pointed to by that article in Spin-Off magazine that I referred to earlier. And then the 3 dyed versions of the yarn are scoured with lye and then dyed with indigo and with synthetic red and synthetic yellow dyes. The fibers below that are just the 2-ply version of that yarn, so twice as thick around. The yarns on the right are spun from tow. And tow is it's the short fibers that are left over after you process out the line fibers. In the processing, as the plant undergoes processing, some of the fibers break. Some of them weren't that long to begin with, and those get combed out. And it yields really kind of woolly looking or cottony looking balls of fiber that you can then process for further spinning into a yarn that's a little bit more like a cotton yarn. So I made yarn that's roughly tens weight. And then I also applied that into tens too. All of them undergoing the same dyeing processes. My goal ultimately is to make enough yarn to make into fabric and to make enough fabric to make into clothes, just as part of my personal creative and practical research with this material. So it might go without saying, but I think it's also really worth repeating that these plants do so much more for us than what I've talked about using them for, which is fiber. Through photosynthesis, they capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it until they die and decompose, which can be a years-long cycle of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. And as native plants, they provide a vital food source and habitat for other native life forms, including fungus, like in this first picture, which shows black smut mildew, which actually grows on the leaves of the milkweed because it's eating the honeydew, which is a sweet liquid that's dropped by aphids. The orange aphids in the photo are actually not native to the US, but they're also not especially harmful to plants, and they provide a lot of food for native predators. So not all non-native species are like a grave danger to our local environment. More examples of wildlife that is supported by these milkweed plants from my front yard are ladybugs, which come to start families and feed on the aphids. This is a milkweed longhorn beetle or red milkweed beetle. And this species has evolved with milkweed. It's obliged to eat milkweed. It doesn't eat anything else. From eggs to larvae to adults, they spend their entire life on the milkweed plant. This milkweed leaf is providing habitat for these earwigs, which are not necessarily the most charming bug, but good food source for birds and small mammals. And here's a much cuter example of a milkweed tussock moth caterpillar, which is again a species that's obliged to feed on milkweed through millennia and more than millennia of co-evolving. And this biodiversity value is really important. At this point, we find ourselves in a multi-critical part of history. We're not just concerned with global climate change, but also the global biodiversity crisis, which the UN addressed in their 2021 biodiversity conference. This chart shows the Living Planet Index, which averages the change in abundance of specific populations of wild species of plants and wild species of vertebrate animals. Since it began being studied in 1970, these specific populations of animals have seen a decrease in vitality of 73%, which is really striking. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are 73% fewer wild animals out in the world. It's a measurement of the health of the populations. So it still is, quite a serious statistic. And quoting the UN's resolution on biodiversity, biodiversity is declining at an unprecedented rate, and the drivers of decline show no sign of abatement. They continue to say that this is an existential threat for humanity. And studies have conclusively shown that crop choice significantly affects local biodiversity. So what you choose to grow has a significant impact on the animals and other life forms in your immediate area. In 2015, researchers at the University of Vermont surveyed arthropod populations at a farm growing milkweed as a crop. They found that the cultivated milkweed provides a significantly better environment for arthropods, which includes like bugs, insects, arachnids, centipedes, other invertebrates. It provides a significantly better environment than other crops that are farmed more intensively. And it's possible that dogbanes and blue stars and false indigos could produce the same results. And in theory, these plants could be cultivated like milkweed without the tillage, the fertilization, herbicide, and insecticide use, which are required by high-intensity crops and are directly associated with arthropod diversity. Just dwelling on this page a little longer, this pilot program for growing milkweed as a crop was focused on using the milkweed floss, which is the fiber that grows in the seed pods, which allows the seeds to like float away like dandelion seeds. They were interested in using that milkweed floss as a replacement for down insulation. And they explored some other material uses of the milkweed floss. And now there are some small and micro fashion businesses that do use milkweed floss for that purpose. And there's a growing cooperative in the Northeast and Canada that's looking to promote the growth of milkweed as a crop. And I might be misinformed or uninformed about this, but as far as I know, they haven't looked into using milkweed as a bast fiber source, which is something that may be worth exploring for them. So moving on, milkweeds in particular, I think, are interesting to me and probably to a lot of people here because they're more than a habitat for just bugs in general. They are great for bugs in general, but there are a lot of species that are obliged to feed on milkweed because milkweed is poisonous, and these species have evolved to be able to eat milkweed and absorb the poison so that they're less preyed upon by predators. And the most famous example is the monarch butterfly, and here's a video of a monarch butterfly caterpillar, which turns into this really big and beautiful and charismatic butterfly. And the thing is that there are species for all of these plants that I've described that are obliged to live and eat on those plants, like the dogbane leaf beetle, which is a really gorgeous metallic beetle. And it only eats dogbane and milkweed species. And maybe a little bit less charming is this. This is the false indigo seed pod weevil, which exclusively feeds on false indigo seeds from eggs to larva to maturity. And supporting these species, I theorize, in an intentional grown as a crop kind of way, might yield positive results for addressing the big decline in monarch butterfly populations, for example. And it also would support the resilience of populations of insects and other living things that aren't threatened, like the dogbane leaf beetle and the false indigo weevil are not at risk right now, but who knows if they might be in the near future. And it's worthwhile to support resilient populations of native flora and fauna. I have done a little bit of figuring out about the potential productivity of these plants. which I would have to say probably wouldn't approach hemp, um, and potentially not approach flax either. Cannabis hemp it's the plant that can grow more useful fiber per acre than cotton. It's a really like um, awesomely productive plant when it comes to fiber and other things. Uh, and the native plants that I've studied, at least in the wild, don't tend to grow together as densely as the cannabis and flax crops do. But as far as I've been able to read, they haven't been like thoroughly tested in that setting either. Um, so it's possible that one of these species or a combination of these species could approach the productivity maybe of flax. Um, in particular, again, advocating blue star species as a fiber source, because they grow in such dense clumps, they provide a lot of fiber material from one plant. And the plants are also very long lived. So once it grows to maturity, it then may be able to provide fiber for like a couple human lifetimes, and maybe more in the context of like a orchard agriculture system rather than a perennial crop system. Um, so slightly drawing to a close here by sharing this image of a stand of dog bane growing near my house in Wisconsin. Um, and wanting to pose the question that even if these plants I've explored could never be as productive as hemp and flax and cotton, if they're grown in a way that proactively provides really positive habitat for local ecosystems, is it a problem that they would need more space devoted to them? It might be a benefit. Okay, and now to really wrap up, I want to end with a bit of a call to action to other researchers, just to express that there's a really significant technology gap in the USA in turning bast fiber crops into textiles. Because bast fiber crops require very specialized processes and machinery for turning into fiber, it's not an easy task to build up that infrastructure. America did have it, like perhaps pre-1900, but bast fiber processing started to leave the country fairly early, especially compared to cotton, which remained until the post-World War II period. As it is now, there's very, very little capacity to industrial process bast fiber crops of any species into fiber. Industrial decorticators are a type of machinery that can turn the plants into fiber. They're becoming more available because cannabis was recently re-legalized as a crop, so growing hemp for fiber is no longer illegal. It's not easy to find one of these machines or to figure out how it might be available to rent time on it or to use in some other context. And even then, decortication is only the first step in preparing the bast fiber. And the intervening steps are not well addressed by emerging technology yet. My call to action is that I think these processes are approachable using modern technology for rapid prototyping and small-scale production, like 3D printing and computer modeling. For inspiration, I look to, going back a slide, a piece of textile machinery that I think a lot of people have encountered called the electric eel wheel, which is a really cool invention that takes the ring spinning component out of a factory spinning context and puts that into the individual fiber studio, replacing some of the machinery with human hands, but maintaining some of that technological capacity that spinning factories have. Another example is this really amazing project by a machinist and artist and researcher, Rose Buttress. Rose invented a way to create a computer-assisted cutting machine for sewn product production. This kind of machinery is part of what makes big factories competitive, cost competitive, that is. And by inventing a version that can quite believably be made by smaller scale studios, it's putting, again, that technological production capacity perhaps back into the hand of the individual maker. And Rose's project is particularly inspiring because they have made it open source and accessible to all at no cost to anyone. And that is the end of my slides. So I'm now going to, I did stop sharing, entering full screen mode, and checking what time it is. Okay, so according to the schedule, we have about a half hour left. And I'm going to, just in case anybody didn't see them earlier, just share that I brought as a collaborator a very late season monarch butterfly caterpillar, who I'm going to return to the uncut milkweed stem after this talk. And I guess I will check the chat and see if any questions have come up. I see that a few have. Saying hi to everyone. Hi, Tariq. Thank you for saying hello. And I see a question from Eileen about the best time to harvest, which I'll talk through now. So it depends on the species, and it depends on whether you want to work with tow fiber or line fiber. The most easy to find species of all the ones I talk about is common milkweed. And the best time to harvest that is in the fall. The leaves will fall off. And at that time, it's not going to be a food source for bugs of any kind anymore. But the bark will still be alive enough that you can peel it off, and it'll still be wet. It'll still have the white sap. And as long as the bark is wet, then you can, from the bark, you can strip out the long line fibers. If you're more interested in working with the tow fibers, like if you're more accustomed to spinning woolen or cotton fiber, then you can wait to harvest milkweed until early spring. And as it overwinters, it'll go through kind of a field retting process. And the fibers won't remain as long and intact, but they'll be easier to comb off of the, sorry, I was just getting a call. Sorry, everyone. A call just came into my cell phone and made the Zoom call go away. Okay, so for the other species, it varies. If you're interested in working with Amsonia, I really recommend harvesting it in early spring, because it responds really well to the overwintering field retting process. And like this bundle behind me is from my backyard. This is Amsonia hubrichtii. And Amsonia is one of the species that is more similar to linen rather than hemp in processing, and the stems are hollow, and you can break them really easily and start to get usable fiber really, really quickly. Like that's the bark. And then like if you're doing it by hand like I was, you can maybe see the toe fibers falling away and the bark kind of turning into dust. And before long, you have fiber that you can make cordage with. And then if you comb it further, then you have fiber that you can spin into yarn. Are there any questions about the other items behind me? Like I can show more species. I will. I see another question that I'll look at in a moment. Just want to show a couple other species. So this is a false indigo stem. And it's kind of understandable why colonists thought that these leaves would yield indigo. If anybody's worked with plant indigo before, when the leaves die, they turn really dark blue. And in this plant, they turn dark black. So going off visual cues, it looks really similar to indigo plants that are grown for that purpose. Also, one of the major sources of indigo is also a legume. So its leaves look really similar to this bush. And false indigo is another one that it's a really tough plant. So I'm kind of straining here. But this is a good one to strip when the bark is green. And then you can see how like the fibers get finer. You can then use like a butter knife to scrape off the green vegetal matter, yielding fiber. And then as the fiber oxidizes, it turns that dark brown color. Okay, I'm going to scroll up in the chat and see another question. I'm going to take a moment to read this. I suppose I should have been reading this out loud. So this is a question. It's longer than I want to going to read, but what do you think about the tension between an inherent respect for Indigenous knowledge, which might not be shareable, and an academic institutions and funders' insistence around the broadest dissemination of the knowledge possible? So I think that the weakest part of my research is that I have only observed historical Native practice through artifacts. And one of my highest priorities is speaking to Native people or a Native person at all. So I think that I'm not also in the best position to answer this because this is my extramural research and I don't receive institutional funding. So my preference would be, as I move forward, to work with, any of the 12 First Peoples of Wisconsin and, Native people more broadly to, in, as non-patronizing a way as possible, like repatriate some of these practices. There's still active dogbane fiber culture. I've found references online to it on the West Coast. it might be more widespread, and I just don't know because I'm not part of the community. But to whatever extent that practice has waned, it may interest Native people to begin working with those materials again. So reading another question, when the milkweed plant is left over winter and then harvested, is it left standing in the field or is it harvested and laid down? Left standing in the field. And that's the way that I've done it. And I haven't tried laying it down over the whole winter. But I guess I just figured that like leaving it standing is the least amount of work. Also, that first article from Spinoff magazine that I shared refers to the person becoming a bit of like a local character because in the early spring, she could be seen going around her town, like picking all the grayed out, half rotting stems of milkweed and carrying them around. And maybe that's something we all could aspire to. And how long do you dry out the harvested plant material? Okay, so if you're harvesting in early spring, it's definitely going to be quite moist from the melting snow. And my practice was to lay it out in the sun for me, what ended up being a couple days until like you could feel that it was brittle. The bark and the pith, the woody part, were brittle and could break easily. If it's wet, then the woody part is flexible and it's harder to break and have it just fall away. If you're harvesting the plant while it's still green and wet to strip out those long line fibers, it does benefit from drying in the sun. I would say for a day or two, because these species have that latex sap that's actually poisonous. So don't lick your fingers while you're processing the, just sharing this at the end, but try to avoid ingesting the sap. So if you lay out the plant to dry, the sap is not coming out and making your hands as sticky as if you stripped it very, very freshly. So I'm going to read this question right now. I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on who the argument to support the use of specific plants should or could be directed toward. Maybe this is framed in terms of industrial scaling versus craft and self-sufficiency. Thinking about the kind of limitations that come from federal research funding contracts that tend to bring products to market and can lead to proprietary agreements and limitations to how freely seeds, materials, etc., of funded projects can be used. Do you have thoughts about who the pitch to better make use of these plants is for? My specific thought about that is to, at this point, make the information that I have as available as possible. And that includes, whatever potentially new research that I have done or just what I've referred to as a source for doing this work, because I definitely want to avoid that issue of proprietariness. And I do see this as equally relevant to foragers and sorry, just checking what time it is. Small scale craftspeople, as well as what I imagine, which is some kind of larger scale growing of fiber to use at an industrial spinning and weaving and apparel making scale is kind of the grand ambition of it. But that also would need to be backed up by research that it actually is better in one way or another. My thought is that it supports native wildlife, but it also potentially could encourage so many of a certain species to grow in a certain area that it becomes like a disease reservoir is one of the like unexpected negative outcomes. So that would be bad. And so my idea about larger scale, like definitely requires further study. But what we can do now is, uh, for those who are interested, just share the availability of this material, share the practices, and develop the practices too, because I'm far from a master spinner. Um, and I just have a bit of a perhaps a head start, although I know that there are lots of people, non-native and native, who work with dog bait fiber in particular. Um, so do you have a way of spinning line fiber on a drop spindle? Um, yeah, I use, so here, I'll show you how long the Amsonia line is. It's like maybe 2.5 to 3 feet long. Um, and I don't use a distaff. Um, Instead of a distaff, I spread it out into like the flat sheet that you do with a distaff on a towel. And then I roll up the towel and I hold that under my arm. And then I can spin from the root end. Or you can also spin from the stem end. But I found it easier to start at the root. um, and I do wet spin with the hand spindle. And I have done a combination, not very systematically, of drop spindle, supported spindle, and medieval style hand spindle spinning. And they've all kind of made yarn. And so, oh, great, we still have time. I'm still fielding questions. Jaleisha, if I didn't answer your particular question about spinning, please post another one so that I can try to get closer. So reading a question from Robin Wilson. Can I talk about my career, interest path, how I began my research, background in textile for interiors, interested in opportunities and potential for undyed natural fibers. Sure, I will talk a bit about my background. I went to college for creative writing and theater at Johns Hopkins University, which has a really cool undergrad creative writing program. And I moved to New York to work in the theater industry. I was like a behind the scenes person. And I was a freelancer, stage carpenter and technician for a couple years. And so I basically like burnt out of that industry. And I had always been interested in style and in fashion. And so I started working at clothing stores in New York. And that was in my like 24, 25 age range. And so I had been interested in like the concept of fashion and being cool and dressing cool, which I'm still interested in. But when I returned to working in clothing, I got really interested in the clothes as objects and the materials they were made from. And so by pursuing that interest, I worked in fashion production in New York. I also worked in wholesale sales for a couple indie fashion brands. And I became really interested in whatever fabric production remains in America, which is pretty small amount. But through like lots of cold calling people and old-fashioned research, I found a couple small-scale weaving mills that are actually a lot better known now than they were then. One of them is Thistle Hill Weavers in upstate New York, which makes fabric for movie costumes, is one thing they're known for. So like historic fabrics for historic costumes. Another is Family Heirloom Weavers in Red Lion, Pennsylvania, who is the person I've worked with closely to make fabric. Um, and they do all kinds of stuff, which you have to do if you're making fabric in America right now. You have to, right now, or for the past like probably 40 years, I don't really know. The industry is just really at a reduced state um, for apparel fabric, I should say, which is my area. And one of the things that really like unlocked fabric production for me was buying on eBay, like an industry blue book from the 90s. So it was like a directory of fabric industry sourcing. And then pretty systematically going through all the listings and just Googling them to see if they were still around. And then if nothing showed up online, I would call the number that was listed because some of them still didn't have websites. Um, and then just from there, being able to talk to those people and eventually work with them to make fabric in some cases. And all of that was really a backwards way of going about it because there are still fiber education programs in the US, including at our program TFD, which focuses on making through by hand, but has really interesting design education. And then at some schools in the Southeast and the Northeast, where the historic fiber industry was located, colleges out there still have like fiber sciences and manufacturing education. So I could have gone and done that, but my path is different. Okay, so that was just a little bit of memoir storytelling, and not sure that that answered your question. I'm also not seeing any other questions, so I will just share a couple examples of some combed fiber. So this is dog bane that I processed into tow. And I haven't done a lot of spinning with dog bane yet, but the fibers are really, really fine, and you can definitely understand why this is like the most used and kind of most important currently American textile plant. And this is Baptisia tow. And it really is such an interesting fiber to me. It has a lot of structure, which remains even after a lot of washing. And the color, depending how dark it is when you pull it off, can remain or it can kind of fade a bit. And here's some Amsonia tow. And then this is Amsonia that I scoured in lye. So it's become bright white. And this used to be the stem of the plant that I've then worked on combing and decorticating. And so even though the fibers have really been kind of abused by the chemical lye, there are still some really long strands that will be interesting to work with making yarn out of. So just in my last couple minutes, I'll grab one more plant, which is a species of milkweed called swamp milkweed. And along with Amsonia, this is a species that I really want to advocate for people exploring. So for common milkweed, which is the easiest to find one, it does have really nice fibers in it, but they're harder to get out. The bark of the plant is thicker, and it takes more work to get the fiber out, which means it's more likely to break as you're doing that. And the bark of swamp milkweed is thinner, and if you can, should have prepared myself better for this, but if you can, there we go. Break and strip off some of the bark, which is not working for me right now. Here we go. The swamp milkweed fibers are really, really fine. And so I think swamp milkweed has a lot of potential as a fiber source. It's also like if you grow swamp milkweed next to common milkweed or next to other species of milkweeds, the bugs and butterflies tend to prefer swamp milkweed. So it's kind of the higher impact in terms of bug life option. Okay, folks, so maybe been vamping or stretching for a little bit. Just going to make sure that I didn't miss any questions, which I don't think that I did. I think that I want to, as I wrap up, just emphasize that politically and ethically, I really advocate for the socially supported and widely disseminated version of this research. And it's my hope that it's possible to work with these materials in a way that that is acceptable to Native people. And I guess the fact is that I haven't tested that hope yet. And part of my goal was just to be a little bit more brave with that in the near future. And I guess I'm voicing that resolution to all of you, maybe to help me hold myself accountable in that way. So I think I'll close it with that. And since it's a smaller group, I don't need to end the call. And if anybody wanted to unmute and just chat for a bit, I'd be happy to spend that time. And if not, I'll just wait until everybody logs off and then I'll end the Zoom.